Hi everyone, I'm Andrew from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny. A couple of days ago, I sat down with some colleagues of mine, Camilla and Ed, to talk about the English Devolution White Paper, which came out in late 2024. I think it was December. We discussed the white paper, some of the things that it does, the reorganisation of local government, and the plans for English devolution for more mayors across the country. And we go into some of the implications for governance and scrutiny, obviously, and what this might look like, and try to give you a sense of what these changes will actually mean on the ground when they happen. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Yeah, I guess the way to start is to get a basic summary of what this white paper is, what it's trying to do. It came out in December and gave us a really, an interesting run up to Christmas where we were all trying to work out what it meant. But Ed, can you give us an impression of actually what the white paper does in really simple terms?
Well, I mean, firstly, what is a white paper?
Yeah.
It's a sort of formal document, sort of laid in Parliament that provides a sense about government's sort of concrete policy proposals and priorities for future piece of legislation. So government's going to produce a bill, a sort of local devolution bill. We don't know exactly what it's going to be called later this year. And the idea is that the white paper preceding that bill gives a really good sense about what the bill's going to contain. The difficulty, I suppose, with the white paper that we've seen come out in December is that in many respects it doesn't have the level of certainty that you would expect in a white paper. In fact, in some ways, it reflects more the kind of content you'd see in a green paper, which is a kind of similar document, the type of which you don't really see very much anymore, which is government laying out possibilities, options. It's kind of more of a discussion paper. And the white paper, as presented, feels in some respects to be more similar to that. And I think that produced its own complexity and confusion as well, because you can read this document and say, this gives me a broad sense in a general way about what government's objectives are and its proposals are, and it gives me a good sense about what the bill is going to contain. But there are lots of questions in there that remain unanswered, and that's particularly the case because the white paper covers so much, and it's easy to miss. There are some big policy areas that are only sketched out in quite limited detail in the document because there is so much of it, and because we fixate on those particular areas that we think are important, which for our purposes, I think, are today are reorganisation and the process that government proposes to adopt to reorganise sort of local authorities, to abolish two-tier areas in England and to unitarise entirely. So we're seeing a model whereby over the course of the coming years, and this will take a few years, two-tier district and county governance in England will be replaced by single-tier unitary councils. And alongside that, the creation of strategic authorities, which up till now we've called combined authorities, which are bodies that sit across quite a wide geographic area that take responsibility for leading policy and long-term decision-making on things like economic development, skills, transport, infrastructure, but increasingly on other big picture issues like health and social care as well. So those are the kind of big things which have focused the attention the most in terms of the white paper. But there's a load of other stuff in there as well. So there's going to be stuff we know in the bill on the local audit framework, which is going to be quite a significant recasting of the way that local audit arrangements are carried out. There's going to be quite a lot in there about standards and about the standards regime for local government. There's going to be provisions in there for remote meetings for local authorities in England as well. And there's going to be a range of other changes, some big, some small, that are all going to connect into this agenda. The biggest, I think, change for me is something which only really gets about one line in the white paper, which is government saying that it's going to pursue public service reform along the similar geographic boundaries to the strategic authority boundaries that are being put in place in England. And it doesn't really explain what it means by this, and so some of this is supposition. But when we talk about public service reform, we mean what we really mean is better aligning the public sector bodies that act and operate in an area to get people working together effectively in partnership to potentially pool budgets, to simplify governance decision making arrangements across an area. And this, I think, is probably the one aspect of the white paper that we're probably going to end up starting to talk about quite a lot more, because it's the part that has the real proper long-term deep implications for how we think about accountability, how we think about scrutiny. So while we're focusing very much at the moment on some of the practicalities, what's reorganisation, what's the process by which we're going to reorganise, what's the process by which the authority is going to be set up, what potentially is the role for overview and scrutiny functions in councils and combined authorities as these changes happen, what are the practical things that colleagues need to be thinking about in the next few months to manage that process. There is this far wider opportunity, this sort of prize, which is this fairly fundamental reshaping of the local state that's sitting on there currently on the horizon but moving really quite fast towards us.
Andrew, you're
I'm on
you're on
mute.
mute.
I'm on mute. So there's so much in that I wonder if we should dig into some of it like briefly. So you mentioned the strategic authorities. They are the mayors, right? So can you give either of you, can you give me an impression of what we're talking about when we talk about the mayors and the strategic authorities? What are these bodies? I know that the strategic authorities is a term we're using to replace combined authorities. So, yeah, Camilla, can you kind of sort of sketch out what they are?
So just sketching this out, and particularly thinking of people who are tuning into this and go, I can't get my head around how does local government currently work, let alone how it's going to work in the future. At the moment, and I had a look at these figures earlier from a paper from 2021 from New Local, actually, and I think it's helpful just to get the size of it. So at the moment, we have about 333 councils in total. It's slightly different to that because it was a couple of years ago. Out of that, 164 of them are district councils, and they are the smaller councils themselves, and they have a often a kind of place-based view. They look at waste. They often have a real role in kind of community services, in play parks, in a lot of management of the kind of the local and what's going on for there. They also have a role in planning. So we've got a lot of those across the country. Now, in two-tier areas, we have a district council and we also have a county council usually. And there are about 24 of those. So they're much, much larger, and they have between kind of 5 and 7 or 8, I think that's the largest, district councils within them. So we've got this two-tier thing going on. So we have one council providing some services, and then another council, the county council, providing these strategic high-level services. And for that, we'd be expecting education, adult social care, children's social care, often a real role in roads, sometimes stimulating the economy as well. So it's a much more strategic function. And you've got these two going on. Now, if you're a person who lives in an area, trying to work out who your councillor is for which council or which council do you write to is quite complicated. And it might be both, or it might be one, or it might be something else. So there is an inherent challenge with that currently. However, in some areas, there are just unitary councils, and we call unitary councils, there's just one council, and it's one council that provides all of those services. There are some just unitaries, we've got some Met districts, and we've got some London boroughs, which functionally are very similar. And I think certainly for our chat today are very similar. The question is, how does government deal with different sized authorities? Where does funding come from? How are local people well represented in a kind of in a consistent way? And at the moment, there isn't a consistent approach across the country. The intention between LGR, local government reorganisation, and I know we throw that around as LGR, trips off the tongue a little bit, and devolution, is that with local government reorganisation, what we're expecting is that government is inviting areas, districts and counties to apply to become a unitary council and to cut the existing geography in a slightly different way. And that has to come from local areas who can apply to central government to change how they're structured. With an expectation that that's going to be unitary. And that could be several districts coming together to form a new council. It could be the county council footprint with the districts coming together to form a new council. The important thing here is these are new councils. These are not existing councils just hoovering up a few extra powers. They are the creation of a new council. Alongside that, and this is, I think, where some of the confusion and the complexity comes in, we've got devolution. And the intention behind devolution is that central government divests itself of some of the powers and certainly some of the funding to local level, to a local area where your mayors, Andrew, absolutely have that power with their councils, with the strategic authorities to go, what needs to happen in this area? How do we approach our transport concerns? How do we approach our wider strategic concerns? Can we draw together a number of different bodies, and can we solve these issues, some of these really complex, challenging issues with the situations that we often are in, at a regional level? What does that look like? Let's bring those together. Let's have some solutions. So the creation of strategic authorities is really meant to feed into that and is about central government letting go of some of that power. So that's what we mean by devolution. It's not new. It's not introduced with this white paper. It's been around for some time, but there are only a limited number of councils that have gone down that path. So the intention behind this white paper and stated behind the government is really to turn the heat up on that, is to make that happen a lot more, because it is seen as an effective way of having a local identity around it, coalescing around clear ideas.
Okay, so let's talk about how some of that's actually going to happen, because there's a process, isn't there, for devolution to take place. So there's a local government reorganisation. So some councils will be turned into larger unitary authorities. And there's also a process by which mayors or by which areas become strategic authorities. So yeah, well, how is that actually going to take place? Because there's a sort of timetable within the white paper for some of this to happen, isn't there? Either of you, whoever wants to go.
Shall I
Yeah,
go?
go for it.
Yeah, I mean, there is, and so I mean, we know roughly what the timetable is for firstly for areas to submit proposals, and secondly for sort of government then to make their determination. But beyond that basic timetable, we know very little about what the process will actually involve. So what we do know is that at the time of recording, we're in early March, and in a couple of weeks' time, towards the end of March, government set a deadline for the submission of proposals for change. We know that government's already obviously selected a handful of areas to form the sort of devolution priority sort of areas. There's a priority programme that is formed of, I think, 6 areas, and the important thing to bear in mind with the devolution priority programme and the submission of proposals is that they're kind of separate but complementary kind of things. So government's is taking proposals on restructure and reorganisation. It's also taking forward this kind of separate sort of devolution activity. Some of that will intersect, so you will see in some areas reorganisation happening at around about the same time as you're having new strategic authorities created, but it's not necessarily going to be the case, which introduces its own degree of confusion into this, because you would assume that in all areas you take forward it all at the same time, but obviously that's not what's happening. So in terms of the devolution priority programme, government is currently consulting on the sort of overarching kind of sort of proposals for change. They're consulting on the proposed geographies, broad stuff about how the authorities themselves will operate in a very, very high level way. What we'll then see is once government has kind of got those responses in, it will be working to develop those proposals in more detail. What we don't yet know is of these initial areas, and the initial areas that are probably going to be taken forward for reorganisation, the process that's going to be used to conduct that activity, because there are existing arrangements in law to reorganise local areas. There are existing arrangements in law to create new combined authorities. The difficulty is not quite knowing yet whether government's going to be using these existing arrangements, and we know what they are. They're all on the face of a couple of different acts of parliament, or if they're going to be using the systems they're going to be introducing in the new bill, which is going to be out later this year. And that introduces its own slight complexity, because therefore we don't quite know A, what government's expectations are, B, what the timetable therefore is going to be for change. In a very broad sense, what we're fairly confident, what people are fairly confident about, is that for areas undertaking reorganisation, probably around next sort of early next year, we're going to be establishing what are called sort of joint committees for the new unitary areas. So there's a sort of staged process for this. So you establish a kind of joint sort of leaders kind of committee first. Then you get what's called a structural change order, which government is using to say we are firing the starting gun on the formal process for the creation of these new authorities. After that, what happens is that you establish what's called the shadow authority, which is the new authority in shadow form. It exists as a legal entity, but it isn't doing any of the local authorities' duties yet. And then you start to see the terminology that's going to start to become more familiar to people. So the shadow authority is existing in the shadows. It's got the member structures. Members of the existing authorities are all members of the shadow authority, and one of the first things to stand up in these new arrangements are scrutiny arrangements. So the member systems are the first thing that are in place. Then over the course of the year, what you're doing is you're filling out that structure. You're starting consultation on new management structure. You're appointing a chief executive. A process beginning whereby you're filling out that body. There's a slow process over the course of the rest of the year within which that's happening. In some areas, what you'll see is that the elections will take place sort of possibly next year. So the shadow authority will have Sorry.
Sorry, Ed. Sorry, are definitely going next year, and the rest of 2027. That's the latest I've read.
Yes, that's what I thought as well. Yeah, but it's shifting sands, isn't it? It differs by area. But what it all works up to is a situation where the subsequent year, the following May, the existing sovereign authorities, the existing councils cease to exist, and the shadow authority becomes the new authority for the area overnight. And there's a process there's a transition process to manage that over the course of the preceding months and the months that follow, to manage the safe and compliant transfer and transition of services into the new authority. So the idea is that residents don't see a change, and they won't see a change immediately, because all the same services are going to be delivered in the same way on day one when you vest the new council. Things continue to be the same. So what you end up doing is, over the course of subsequent years, there is then the slow process by which the new council is getting to grip with its services, is getting to grips with the fact that obviously it's delivering its waste service in 3 different ways across its area. So it is redesigning and is recasting and probably recommissioning activity across that area over the course of a number of years, and it is happening quite slowly. So you don't see those changes immediately, and this is why it's dangerous to assume that reorganisation itself is going to immediately unlock financial savings, because it isn't. Because the savings that do come, when they come, are quite long-term in nature, because they're about redesigning services across a wider geographical area, which is not going to happen overnight. So there's that aspect of it. And then realise I've been talking for a long time. Then we move on to the strategic authorities and the process for establishing them, and the mechanics about what that looks like. And that's again, depends on whether we're doing that under the existing act, or whether the new bill is going to give us a new structure and process for it. But at the moment, what that looks like is there is a process of negotiation between the area when its boundaries have been agreed, and government, about the nature of the exact nature of the devolution deal. So we've got the overall proposals in. We know, roughly speaking, what those look like. But government in the white paper has been quite clear that it's establishing a devolution framework by which the powers it is going to be devolving look more consistent across the country. So we're not going to see the kind of bespoke deal making that we saw previously under the previous government. There's going to be more consistency around which areas get what. Some areas will benefit from what's called an integrated settlement, which is a kind of non-ring fenced kind of funding agreement where government's saying, here is a settlement to deliver what is within your responsibilities. Go and do that. And that's integrated settlement is in place, or is going to be in place, for a handful of existing combined authority areas. Other areas, I think, will aspire to that and will want to move towards that, but are not in that space yet. So for those areas, those strategic authorities are probably, again, we don't have a precise timetable on exactly when they're going to be established. If you look at the timetable that's taken, the length of time it took to establish some of the current ones, it can and does happen quite quickly. But we can't at the moment, while the consultation is still underway. Government is still consulting on the geography, still consulting on the powers generally. We can't be 100% sure and say, oh yes, all these SAs are going to be established from next May. We've got to be a little bit cautious, but we are looking. The timescales for all of this are medium term. It is the next year, 18 months to 2 year kind of period. For the vanguard of areas, that's what we're looking at, and then other parts of England will follow thereafter.
So that's going to be a slower process. We've got the priority areas first, and then perhaps over the next 5 years or so, we'll see other authorities following.
I think that's right. I think government, you don't know how much to read into this. One suspects that government would have loved to do it all this Parliament, and would have loved to do it all within this parliamentary term, so that it's so that before the next election, all these arrangements are in place. The sector and government do not have the capacity to be able to do that. Even if there is the will to do it, there is not the capacity to manage that within the sector, within Whitehall. So it is going to be a slow process, and there will be people thinking now, oh, my district might not exist in 2 years' time. By and large, the immediate areas being selected for reorganisation aside, existing two-tier areas have still got a fair bit of life in them. I think it is going to be a medium-term thing for most areas, and those areas particularly where there is no current agreement on what the geography should look like. Even though government is pushing for that to happen, realistically, we know it's going to take quite a bit longer than government might want, or that other people might expect.
I guess it's worth just bringing up the priority areas. So it's Cumbria, Cheshire and Warrington, Norfolk and Suffolk, Greater Essex, Sussex and Brighton, Hampshire and the Solent. So those are the places that we're going to see, forgive my dog, moving straight away, and expecting to have mayoral elections next year, in fact. That's the most ambitious timeframe. We're not sure whether it's going to happen, are we? It will depend a little bit on, but that's the aim that they have. I guess a question that will be in a lot of people's heads is, why do all of this together when it's such a lot of work? And these are two different things. So do we have, I mean, I know we cannot speak for government, it's not our job to do that, but do we have thoughts on why some of this is happening together? I know that some areas of the country that we're talking about, those priority areas included, in the areas with the county councils and districts, it's a bit more complicated to do devolution. Is that right, Camilla?
So Ed, you look like you wanted to come in there, so I just
Sorry.
wanted to no. So there's several things I wanted to throw into Ed's answer last time. I think there's this patchwork of the way that local government is organised is a challenge, and I think it's a challenge considering that from a citizen perspective. I think it's a challenge considering that from a councillor perspective. I think it's a challenge considering it from an officer perspective, moving between different things and how different things are done. I think there is a realism starting to creep in with government, because we see some areas that are prepared, ready, have positive relationships relationships with other similar councils who are willing to either band together and become a strategic authority, or create a new unitary authority, whether that's Devo or LGR. I think what we see in some areas is some ages old disagreements, and some real regional identities that this is very challenging to. And I think, there is a realism from central government going, actually, where there are, and the MJ is peppered with several stories about this at the moment. And I won't name particular areas, but there's certainly a few out there currently, and I expect there will be more, where particular areas have a very strong identity and don't feel that they want to dilute that identity by changing names, changing areas, and or working with neighbours and working with different areas. That's really challenging to then band together either in a strategic authority or as a unitary. And I think, where Ed was laying out that process, there are some really key steps within that process. One of them is the idea, and I emphasised this when I was talking first of all, around these are new authorities, these are new organisations that are created from scratch. They may well continue with similar faces that some of the previous, particularly for LGR, local government reorganisation, some of the previous councils had beforehand, but they are new. And so alongside that newness, there is an opportunity to reevaluate what's in your constitution. How are you set up? What are your aims? Let's go back to basics. And actually to do that right from a leadership perspective, from a governance perspective, takes time. That isn't something that can be done yesterday, and it's not something that can be done really, really quickly. To get that right, to make sure that the culture sets off on the right foot, to make sure that the relationships are really clearly there. And Ed, you did talk about, starting to employ staff and starting to get things up in any shadow authority. Actually, there's a lot of work that needs to go in to support that process, but also to take forward what is fantastic about previous organisations, about the councils that have already existed. So, that kind of post-mortem elements of what's worked here, what's our story, what do we need to take forward, what do we want a new authority to understand, to know, to learn on day two, perhaps not day one, on day two when they are in operation, because there are a lot of narratives that really do need to be taken forward. So I think there is much wider than just let's look forward. Whilst that's very important, there's also the let's be very clear about what our lessons learned are from where we have been, from what our journeys have been, and then how do we take that forward and how do we step forward with that really, really strong foot. And I think that was something I just wanted to sort of reflect in there before we get into too much of the process detail, because I think there is a key point around leadership that can be lost here, because there is a real key need for leadership from the sector.
So yeah. I mean, I think I completely agree with all of that. I think the other issue with the sequencing is that this question of identity and the idea of a sense of place is sort of muddied slightly by the sequencing. So we've got a situation where I wasn't perhaps explicit in when I was talking previously about this, but we're going to be in a situation where for those devolution priority areas, at least, you're going to see strategic authorities set up, and then afterwards LGR is going to happen. So the first kind of year or so of operation of new strategic authorities is going to be with the existing local government structure, and then you're going to see a shift, which will mean a shift and change in personnel, of capacity of new organisations to take in. So it's going to be a really choppy start for strategic authorities and new unitaries in this environment, getting used to a period over the course of 2 years or so of continuing change. And identity is a really, really strong part of that narrative, how you create new institutions. I think part of that, there's sort of two elements of that really. So firstly, it's the thing about the need for the existing councils to end well, to pass on their knowledge, their experience, their insights, for you to understand, as Camilla says, what are the ways of working that you want to pick up and carry through to a new institution? What are the sort of the positive ways that council has operated for many years that you can take on? And there's also something alongside which potentially works against that slightly, which is saying how should we make a clean break from old systems of operation? How are we going to innovate? How are we going to use this once in a generation opportunity to do something quite different with the way that we exist? And part of that is about trying to embed yourself in as a legitimate kind of organisation for the new area. And this is a real challenge for this kind of this sense of a loss of local identity. And I think you can look at that and you can think, well, people don't really care what the logo is on their wheelie bin. People don't, the same services ultimately are going to be delivered to the same people by the same people by and large, certainly in the short term. And I kind of agree with that up to a point, but there is something more fundamental about local democracy and about the legitimacy of our institutions and about the work we're doing as democratic institutions to make sure that we have that connection to local people, and that we can rebuild that connection. There's this kind of worry about the creation of these kind of new remote councils, everywhere having kind of generic names like Southeast Northwestershire and all this kind of thing, and they're not really being that connection. And this was a problem that the new councils had in the early 70s. When that whole new council structure was created, there was that worry about remoteness then as well. So I think we're going to see a lot of that replaying. So I think the existing councils and new institutions are going to have to do quite a lot of work in that space, and councillors are going to have to do a lot of work in that space, while they and the officers that serve them are in this position of enormous uncertainty of knowing, am I going to put myself up for election? Am I going to get elected? Am I going to have to represent an area that I'm not as familiar with? I'm going to have to take responsibility for thinking about services across a wider area. I know my patch, but I don't know over here. For officers as well, designing this framework and thinking about governance in this framework, thinking about colleagues in Dem Services, legal governance, you're doing this really, really big work in trying to create and build a new authority from scratch. At the same time, you're thinking, am I going to have a job in 4 months' time? Am I still going to be employed? Am I going to be basically, does the 31st of March herald, the end of my employment in local government in this area? And it's a really unsettling and worrying time for officers and members in this position, while they're being asked to do some really fundamental and difficult and complex and painstaking work, as well as having this real personal and professional uncertainty about what the future role is going to be. And I think there's we can't underplay how difficult that is, and the need for the kind of support systems that national bodies like ourselves, but also membership bodies like, on the officer side, ADSO and NLG provide to kind of create a supportive environment for officers to carry out their role, and also membership institutions like political parties and the LGA provide to members as well in making sure that they're supported too, but also mutual officer member support in making sure that we all have a common sense, a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve through this process. It's not just about a gloomy situation of shutting everything down, turning out the lights and locking the door. There is something about how do we carry this stuff over and give your existing ways of working where they're positive a sense of longevity into that new institution. And I think we can think positively about this, notwithstanding the obvious personal pressures and disappointments and stresses that are going to accompany this exercise.
Sorry, I'm on mute again. So we've talked about the reorganisation. We've talked about the strategic authorities in quite a lot of detail. I think there are two things or two aspects to this that, one big aspect, I guess, for us, which is we are changing the local state in a really profound way. We're going to have big strategic authorities governing 1.5 million people or more. We've got unitary authorities at a larger level. So two big questions, really. The first one is, if we have bigger unitary authorities, what happens to local accountability for the kind of community issues that district councils have generally governed? So that would be the first one. And then we'll move on after that to talk about this, I think the big thing for us, which is what happens to scrutiny and governance in a space where local government looks really different. But if we can deal with that sort of what we've sometimes referred to as a kind of hyper-local accountability or democratic deficit, what should be done in that space? The government has talked a little bit in the white paper about it, but only in I think about a paragraph basically. So yeah, what are the options there?
Shall I kick off, Ed, and then you can jump in? Because I think both of us have probably views on both of those subjects, Andrew. So I think, the opportunity here is that you have a larger authority, and that can take a strategic regional approach. And that in some instances makes lots of sense. So if you are organising universal services that cover a particular bigger authority area, so that 500,000 population, theoretically at least, there should be economies of scale that go alongside that. Of course, the converse of that is that where there is a town or where there are different regional understandings and different regional approaches, actually in a larger authority, will those voices still be reflected in there? Now, one consideration is to think about where town and parish councils fit in. And at the moment, there are somewhere in the region of 10,000, I think. I don't know what the exact number is, town and parish councils that exist. And they vary in size from being, hyper local, where they are really tiny, to almost at the point of being equivalent to very small district councils, where they have taken on the running of a number of services, whether they be parks, theatres, or similar other local services, and having a different dialogue with local people and a different identity. So once again, there is that local identity. I think the challenge around that is the rural versus urban, because it tends to be in urban areas that we might see the creation or the expansion of town councils predominantly, whereas in rural areas where you have perhaps more of a spread out geography, there aren't necessarily the numbers, and there aren't necessarily the kind of the focal point to bring people together in that way, which I think is a challenge. I'll stop talking. Ed, you're nodding. Do you want to add to that one before we get on to Andrew's second question?
No, I agree. I think it's much, for me, it feels clearer about what might happen in urban places than in rural ones. So I think one of the worries that probably quite a lot of people are sort of feeling about this is that there are a lot of cities and large towns that up till now have enjoyed their own distinct municipal governance, in many cases for many hundreds of years, and that won't all of a sudden. And it's thinking, well, what do we do to those with those institutions? And you look back at previous reorganisation activity, and you look at the opportunity to create new. So people call them urban parishes, and I think it's that it makes it sound not to. Well, I was going to say it makes it sound parochial, but that makes it sound like I'm trying to make a pun, which I'm not. But it's about it's thinking about that those local councils in different ways, and thinking, well, if you're reorganising in Norfolk, for example, and if you're accepting the premise, which I know that not everybody will, but let's, for the sake of this argument, go with this, that under a future unitary model for Norfolk, there will not be a separate Norwich City Council as a principal authority. So, and if you say, well, Norwich ought to have its own civic governance, it's still a city, and it enjoys the privileges of a city, and so it ought to have that. And if you think, well, what are there services that are better delivered in that hyper local form? Community development, aspects of clean and green style services, some aspects of youth services, for example, which you could deliver citywide. And a city like Norwich is big, and if you had a council, a first tier council that was delivering those services in those areas, it would not be a small institution. It would be an institution like Salisbury City Council, which was created in the aftermath of the 2009 sort of Wiltshire reorganisation, or in the aftermath of the 2009 Shropshire reorganisation, Shrewsbury sort of City Council as well. These are institutions created to manage the perceived risk of a loss of that form of municipal governance. And I think we will see that. I think the question mark, as you've said, Camilla, lies about the rural areas and about the need for a connection in those rural areas. My gut feeling is that you will see potentially existing parished areas thinking, how can we work together so as to pool our resources and capabilities to be able to play a more active role? There are some parishes that are very, very small, I hesitate to say moribund, but who don't have the capacity and capability to be able to do stuff. With the loss of districts, which have that slightly more local focus than a big new unitary would do, you wonder if that will be a catalyst for people in those areas to come together and say, what is it that we can do to so there is a louder locality voice with the new unitary. And what is there that the new unitaries can do to act on this as well? Not just, oh, let's just trigger a community governance review to reorganise sort of local councils in this area, but having conversations with their parish areas and saying how can we work better together to make sure that there is that link in a way that might previously not have happened. And so we go back to the thing we were talking about previously about you're creating new institutions, and part of creating new institutions is recreating and reimagining the relationship that those new institutions have with their partners, and their partners include parishes and putative parish councils in urban areas as well. So I think there is an opportunity there. It's quite difficult to articulate at the moment because we're very much at the early part of the conversation, but it's something we're really keen, obviously, at CFGS to explore further, isn't it?
It is. I've just got one follow-up question, which is presumably those unitary authorities could delegate some responsibilities to those kind of. Is that possible? I mean,
sort. I mean, yes.
In theory, yes. In theory,
it depends.
yes.
It depends.
But yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, Andrew, you're muted again.
I don't know why I keep doing that. Let's return to that then at some stage, because that's obviously really interesting. So shall we talk then about what I think is kind of we've left to last, but feel like it's the big thing for us in a sense, or the big thing for governance and scrutiny, which is what we think the changes are to this new landscape that's emerging. And I know that some of those changes are about the change itself. So I think there's stuff around the fact that we're seeing a transition and there is a requirement to, as you say, Ed, end well, and to think about transformation. But there's also a sense in which strategic authorities in particular, and larger unitary authorities, and this is your point, Camilla, will be doing bigger things, right? They'll be making greater trade-offs. So how do we think or rethink of governance and scrutiny, taking account of that? So how do we create the right levels of accountability to take account of this new system? And I know that CFGS has done a lot of thinking about this in the past, not just now. We've obviously developed the local public accounts committee model as a potential answer, and that's addressed in the white paper as one of the potential solutions to some of these issues. But yeah, Camilla, do you want to go first and give us an impression of some of these big sort of scrutiny problems or governance and scrutiny problems that might rear their head? And I say problems, we're really, perhaps that's the wrong way of framing it. It's more
challenges.
About challenges and opportunities, right? I mean, actually, some of this is positive.
Thank you, Andrew. Happy to do so, and probably will come back as well. I think your point is we're in a moment of disruption, and you can view a moment of disruption in positive and negative ways, and it has both. And so for some people, Ed's point, feeling really nervous, really uncertain about the future, that's a reality. At the same time, there are opportunities alongside this with a greater say for local government and a greater ability for local government to have autonomy over the things that it's running. So I think we're at a moment of disruption. The first thing I wanted to say, and this is slightly sidestepping your question, Andrew, so apologies, but is keeping the scrutiny element, I think, is that this is going to be occupying a huge amount of space. So for the many local authorities, I know not all, because we do have those unitaries that already exist, and we do have strategic authorities, combined authorities in some places already, but for most of the rest authorities across the country at the moment, this is going to be occupying a significant amount of headspace of discussions among political groups, discussions among officers, discussions between organisations, and a lot of airspace. And I think the first thing I want to say around scrutiny is actually local government is in quite a challenged position. We're seeing more financial challenges for local government as the demand for services increases, and perhaps spending doesn't, the spending envelope doesn't increase comparatively at the same time. So I think scrutiny has more of a role, and should have more of the role, and should not be going, oh, LGR is going to happen. Let's take a back seat. Let's just talk about how we're going to reorganise. Actually, there is still the day job. There is still business as usual. Services are still being provided, and that role of scrutiny, that role of accountability, and that role of how do we imagine the future? And this is quite an unsung role of scrutiny, but I think a very important one is going, what's now? What would be appropriate? How do we know? Where's our evidence base for that? How are we talking to people? Are we developing an idea, regardless of structure, about how we would like that service to be provided, or how we would like a series of interactions to happen, so that the service doesn't need to be provided at all, but actually people can be supported to live an independent life, for example. And I think allied to that is very much this idea about empowering scrutiny, recognizing the role of scrutiny, having those conversations, but scrutiny continuing to develop its ideas about what the future looks like. And I think that's my first sort of message to all practitioners out there, whether they're counsellors, officers, or whoever's listening to this. I think there is a lot of road to run before the magic wand is waved and suddenly everywhere is a unitary and suddenly everywhere is a mayoral authority. Having said that, there is still a need for scrutiny of those authorities and how that comes in. And I think, perhaps, so I've sidestepped your question, Andrew, a little bit, but I think in the short to mid-term, and so short term for me is 1 to 2 years, mid-term is 5 years. I think scrutiny continues to have an absolute role. I think there is a real challenge about how local people's voices are heard. And we know that scrutiny is one of the vectors, one of the key places that hearing from local people happens. That's part of its setup, that's part of its raison d'etre. And when I was head of scrutiny, on an average year, we would hear from about 250 people as part of task groups, as part of committee meetings. That role, that local voice in there is incredibly important, particularly as this unfolds, particularly as the uncertainty about who's going to be running which bit of which council and which service, and how does this work? I think hearing from local voice, that amplification becomes even more important, and scrutiny playing that role, whether that's in how is the service working, or how does LGR work, local government reorganisation work? I think scrutiny amplifying the role, voice, concerns of the public is even more important, if you can say that, than it has been before, because I think that is really the heart of what we need to get to. How are local people reflected in whatever structure is set up? And really, regardless of the structure, regardless of the process, we're talking outcomes, we're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about how things are set up in order to provide the best. And I think whenever we speak to councils and wherever we go, what's the point of scrutiny? They always come back and they always go, it's to make things better for our residents. That's what we want. And hearing that through and seeing that through. And I think that comes at front and centre throughout everything that we're doing, regardless of structure, regardless of process. I think that's the one thing to hold on to. I'll give way there because I've got more to say, but Ed, please come in so I don't hog the whole session.
Ed, will you answer my question?
I have to probably remember what the question is in the first place. It was about sort of the approaches that.
It's really that we know that we're changing so that what Camilla's done really well was the first part of my question, which is that there is a transformation going on, and the transition is a scrutiny challenge and a governance challenge in itself. But beyond that, when we're looking at what happens over, if the government gets its way and its vision is realised, we're going to have mayors everywhere, basically, and they're going to be doing more. And we're also going to have bigger units of local government. And that means that the way that we think about scrutiny and about governance is going to change. And I just wanted to get an impression of some of the changes that we think, or the questions that we need to ask, really, about how that's going to happen, because or how the scrutiny and governance processes within local authorities and within strategic authorities meet this new expectation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the point to make around this is that strategic authorities are not just big councils. They are fundamentally different kinds of institutions doing different kinds of work. And I think part of the problem that I think we've probably had is that because strategic authorities have by and large been sort of birthed from local government. So the people setting them up have been councils, and they've had their constitutions written by existing council monitoring officers. Their cabinets are made up of councillors. Some of, not all of their staff are from local government. It promotes this sort of thinking that, well, they work fundamentally like councils do, and of course they don't. They're doing very, very different things. And I think we increasingly need to think about governance needs for strategic authorities as being quite different, and the way that we conduct overview and scrutiny in strategic authorities therefore also being quite different. I think if you look at the government, well, it's the former government scrutiny protocol now, it sort of set part of the direction on that, sort of saying here are the ways that we expect scrutiny to be carried out in strategic authorities. And if you've not seen that, it's a more it's a significantly more directive instruction to combined authorities as they currently are about how scrutiny ought to be done in those places, much more directive than is the case for local authorities. Government's committed to revisiting that and enhancing it, and I think we will see there something more explicitly setting out here is how and why we think strategic authority scrutiny needs to be different, and here is how that difference is something we can make sense of in reality. So here is the different ways of working. That's still evolving. So I think that's something. In local government, I think a lot of the existing ways that we do and think about scrutiny are kind of going to carry over to new authorities, but I think it provides you the opportunity to kind of reflect in the way that Camilla has said about sort of the way that we do things, think about scrutiny's core tasks, and I think that connection to local people is a really, really important one. The testing, the sort of visioning activity of saying, what do local people need? Who are our people now? You're a new council. Who are our residents? What do we understand of them? What do we understand about their needs? And there's a really, really important role that scrutiny can perform there in the first couple of years of an authority being in place to anchor that authority's understanding about the place that it serves. I think that's a really exciting opportunity for a new council, a new area. There's also something, that really, really important role that scrutiny has in assurance. So again, for a new authority, in its first 5 years, behind the scenes, officers will be creating new and more consistent methods for the boring stuff: risk management, performance management, financial control and management. And I think scrutiny, alongside the audit functions of councils, has a really, really important role to play in kind of holding a member understanding, maintaining a member grip on those issues, and saying we want to make sure that we're assured that the business as usual things that Camilla was talking about are still being gripped effectively, that we're still managing services effectively, that as we transform, as we will, because that's an inevitable product of the reorganisation exercise, we're doing so in a way that's going to maintain safe, compliant legal services. So I think that there is something there that says there is perhaps a more focused role that scrutiny can perform in those new authorities in the first couple of years, that focuses on the unique challenge and opportunities that arise from being a brand new authority. And I think that allows scrutiny in those authorities to evolve in a direction that sees it doing work that is perceived as being of greater value, and is potentially of greater value as well, because you've got that clearer focus. But I think you look back at other LGR exercises and you say where things have, and I hesitate to talk about things not having worked very well, but I think it's incontrovertible that there are some previous reorganisation activities where the results has been a bit suboptimal. A lot of that, in my view, has been about a failure, an insufficient focus at the start on those fundamental issues about what is local need, what are local people's needs and expectations, what are the systems that we're putting in place to assure service management and delivery from a member perspective, those kind of fundamental things, which sometimes I think get lost in the freneticism of firstly the transition process itself, and then after the transition process think, God, how are we now going to reorganise all of these services which are delivered differently in a patchwork of different ways across the former district areas? We need to kind of transform, and there's a tendency to sort of think, let's launch ourselves wholesale into a massive transformation exercise to release savings, natural, but without thinking about where's the member governance, where's the member oversight in this. So I think that the member side of it feels to me really, really, really important. That it's a and it's something we say to senior leaders and chief execs and leaders of councils a lot in this process of making sure that scrutiny is kind of front and centre, because for shadow authorities, as I said before, it's one of the first things that gets set up, bizarrely, is the scrutiny function of the shadow authorities, like almost the first thing that's there. So use it effectively to manage the process. And for strategic authorities, again, use that, the ability of being able to bring members together in that way, use the framework of the scrutiny protocol to manage the establishment and operation of that institution as well.
Still muted, Andrew.
Why do I keep doing that? The problem I've had all the way through this conversation is that my dog keeps running downstairs and starting to bark. So that's why I've been on mute all the time. So I think that's pretty much that's enough, basically. I think we've done a good job of introducing people to some of the issues, challenges, opportunities, some of the complexity around this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Right, we can stop recording then, if I can work out how. There we go.